She was 19 years old when the county marshal nailed the eviction notice to her front door, and the man who ordered it done was her own uncle, Thaddeus Coyne, who had lent her father money against the family orchard 2 winters before, and called the debt due within a week of burying him. Odessa Marsh left the only home she had ever known, with $11.30 knotted into her shawl. And when the county sold off the wreck of the vanished Alkali Wells freight convoy, 3 wagons found stripped and abandoned out past the yucca breaks, their canvas tops slashed and their beds filled with nothing, everyone swore, but plain desert sand. She spent every last coin on what the whole town called a fool's bargain. "It's only sand," the auctioneer told her, not unkindly, as he handed her the bill of sale. He did not know that packed beneath that sand, sealed by a dying man's own hands, lay something that would keep a starving town alive through the hardest winter it had ever known, and bring a long overdue reckoning down on the uncle who had cast her out. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Odessa Marsh. If you've ever been told that what little you have left isn't worth anything at all, we'd love for you to stay with us a while. Follow along for more stories like hers, and if you would, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight. We read every one, and it means more to us than you'd think. Odessa had grown up on 40 acres of stubborn orchard ground outside the town of Cedar Bend, in the high dry country where the rivers ran thin and every fruit tree her father planted had to be coaxed along with more patience than water. Her father, Nathaniel Marsh, had come west as a young man with nothing but a satchel of grafting knives and a conviction, inherited from his own father back in Ohio, that an orchard was not merely a business, but a kind of covenant between a person and the land. That if you tended a tree honestly, season after season, without cutting corners or forcing more fruit than the ground could rightly give, the land would eventually repay you tenfold. He taught Odessa to graft before she was 10 years old, guiding her small hands as she fitted a scion of one variety onto the rootstock of a hardier one, binding the wound with wax cloth and patience, waiting through a whole season to see whether the graft would take. "You can't rush a tree into trusting you, Odessa," he used to say, working beside her in the slanting afternoon light. "It has to feel, over time, that you mean to keep your word." She did not understand then how much that lesson would come to matter in a life that had nothing to do with orchards at all. Her mother, Corinne, had died bringing Odessa's younger brother into the world when Odessa was only 6, and the boy, named Silas, had followed his mother within the year, leaving Nathaniel Marsh to raise his daughter alone amid the rows of apple and quince trees he had planted as a young husband, still full of hope. He never remarried, and he never spoke of Corinne with anything but a soft, careful tenderness that taught Odessa, without a single lecture on the subject. That love did not need to announce itself loudly to be real. What he could not entirely shield her from was his brother Thaddeus, a restless, ambitious man who drifted through Cedar Bend every year or two with some new scheme, a freight contract, a mining claim, a partnership in a stagecoach line, each one promising to make his fortune, and each one, sooner or later, quietly failing, leaving behind debts that he seemed to expect his more settled brother to help absorb. Nathaniel always obliged him. Out of a loyalty Odessa privately thought her uncle did little to deserve, and it was one of these arrangements, a loan taken against the orchard itself to help Thaddeus recover from a freight venture gone bad, that would prove, in the end, to be the ruin of everything Nathaniel Marsh had spent his life building. Odessa grew up quick-handed and watchful, the way children of widowers in hard country often do, capable of running the orchard's modest accounts by the time she was 14. Capable of reading a tree's health from the color of its leaves and the give of its bark long before most grown men in Cedar Bend could tell a healthy quince from a dying one. She learned, too, a particular kind of patience from the grafting work itself. The understanding that some of the most valuable things in the world did not look like much of anything in their early, unfinished state. That a spindly, awkward graft wound in waxcloth could, given a full season's trust, become the strongest branch on the whole tree. It was a lesson she carried with her long after she had any reason to think of it in terms of orchards at all. Her father's health began to fail when she was 17, a slow wasting sickness that the town doctor could not properly name. And in the 2 years she spent nursing him through it, Odessa watched her uncle Thaddeus grow strangely attentive, visiting more often than he had in a decade, asking pointed questions about the loan papers and the deed to the orchard with a solicitousness that never quite masked the calculation underneath it. Nathaniel Marsh died in the autumn of what would have been Odessa's 19th year, and within a fortnight, Thaddeus Coyne arrived with a stack of papers showing that the loan against the orchard, with interest compounded in a manner Odessa did not fully understand, and had no lawyer to help her question, was now due in full, and that in lieu of payment, he was taking the orchard itself in settlement. The county marshal, an unhurried man named Otis Bramwell, who had known Nathaniel Marsh for 20 years and plainly took no pleasure in the errand, nailed the notice to the door all the same, because the papers, however Odessa's instincts protested them, appeared to be in proper legal order. She left Cedar Bend's Orchard Road with $11.30, her father's old grafting knife, and a small tin box of seed catalogs and letters that Thaddeus had not thought worth confiscating. For the better part of a year she moved between odd situations, mending harness leather for the livery in exchange for a corner of the hayloft to sleep in, keeping books for the dry goods store when the widow who owned it found her arithmetic overwhelmed by the demands of a growing trade, taking in sewing when there was nothing else to be had. The town regarded her, in that gentle, maddening way small towns often regard the recently ruined, with a sympathy that never quite extended to practical help. And Odessa learned to expect little from anyone's pity and less from anyone's charity. It was in the deep chill of the following winter that word went through Cedar Bend of the Alkali Wells freight convoy. 3 heavy wagons that had set out from the railhead at Marrow Junction bound for the mining camps beyond the yucca breaks, carrying tools, dry goods, and by the manifest everyone in town had heard, recited a dozen times over, a modest shipment of packing sand meant to reinforce the foundations of a new grain depot the county had finally funded after years of harvests lost to poor storage. The convoy never arrived. When a search party found the wagons at last, abandoned in a narrow draw off the main trail, the canvas tops had been slashed and the tool crates emptied, but the wagon beds themselves were filled nearly to the rails with what looked, to every eye that examined them, like plain desert sand, heavy, useless ballast that no raider in his right mind would have troubled to steal, because the one thing the Yucca Breaks country had never lacked was sand. The wagon master, a quiet, careful man named Eli Okonkwo, who had freighted goods through that country for 15 years without incident, was never found, and was presumed to have perished at the hands of whatever raiders had struck the convoy. The county, unwilling to spend good money hauling 3 ruined, sand-filled wagons anywhere useful, put them up for auction as scrap, and the bidding, such as it was, lasted less than 2 minutes. Odessa bid $11 for all 3 wagons, and the room laughed the way rooms laugh at people they have already decided are beneath serious consideration. Her uncle Thaddeus, who happened to be in Marrow Junction that week settling some new venture of his own, heard of it before the week was out and remarked to anyone who would listen that his niece had finally found something as worthless as she herself had become since losing her father's good sense to look after her. She said nothing in reply when the story reached her, only turned the words over once in her mind and set them aside, the way her father had taught her to set aside anything that did not serve the patient work in front of her. It took Odessa the better part of a week, and a promise to mend every strap of harness the livery owner possessed for a full season, to haul the 3 wrecked wagons back to a corner of his fenced yard in Cedar Bend, where she began the slow, unglamorous work of clearing them out, not because she expected to find treasure, but because it was not in her nature to own something, however worthless, without first knowing exactly what it was. She noticed, almost from the first shovelful, that the sand filling the wagon beds was wrong for the country it had supposedly been gathered from. It was pale and fine, almost silvery in the winter light, nothing like the coarse red grit of the Yucca Breaks Trail, but closely resembling the pale flood sand that collected along the banks of the Marrow River, a full day's haul from where the convoy had vanished. Her father had taught her that nothing in a well-kept orchard was ever placed by accident, and she found herself applying the same suspicion to a wagon-load of sand that seemed to have been chosen and hauled with deliberate care. She dug by hand, the way her father had taught her to work a graft wound, slow, exact, unwilling to force anything before its time, and near the bottom of the lead wagon's bed, beneath better than 2 feet of that pale river sand, her fingers found the corner of something wrapped in heavy waxed canvas, bound tight with cord and tar against the damp. It took her the better part of an hour, working by lantern light in the freezing yard, to work the bindings loose, and when she finally peeled back the waxed canvas, she found not coin, not silver, but seed, pound upon pound of carefully preserved fruit tree seed and grafting stock, packed in oiled cloth and layered with dried moss to keep it viable, along with a leather-bound notebook, whose careful, familiar hand made Odessa's breath catch before she had read a single word. Because it was not so very different from her own father's hand. Trained, she would soon learn, by the very same orchard tradition. The notebook belonged to Eli Okonkwo, and its early pages were ordinary freight notes, loads and distances and the health of the mules. But partway through, in entries dated only weeks before the convoy vanished, the tone changed entirely. Okonkwo, it turned out, had once trained as a horticulturalist before he ever took up freighting, and he had been quietly commissioned, in the months before his disappearance, by a group of desperate farmers and orchard keepers scattered through the county. Cedar Bend among them, though under names Odessa did not recognize at first, to transport a rare and hard-won shipment of blight-resistant fruit tree stock, developed painstakingly over a decade by a horticultural society back east, meant to replace the diseased orchards that a spreading canker rot had been quietly destroying throughout the region for the past several seasons, Nathaniel Marsh's own trees among them. Though Odessa had never known the full extent of what her father had been fighting in his final years, the stock was irreplaceable and desperately needed, and Okonkwo, growing suspicious of certain parties who seemed unusually eager to know the convoy's exact route and timing, had made the decision, on his own authority, to hide the seed stock beneath ordinary sand, where no thief hunting for coin or tools would think to look twice, trusting that whoever eventually found it would be patient enough to dig deep enough to matter. His final entries, hurried and increasingly anxious, named the party he had come to suspect of meaning the shipment harm, a freight broker and land speculator operating out of Marrow Junction, who stood to profit enormously if the region's diseased orchards failed entirely and their land could be bought up cheap for grazing instead. A man Okonkwo referred to, in one damning entry, only as TC, a man who had, Okonkwo wrote, been asking pointed questions about the shipment's route through a nephew he kept installed at the freight office, and who Okonkwo now believed meant to see the resistant stock destroyed before it could ever reach the farmers who so badly needed it. The very last entry, written, Odessa guessed, in the hours before the convoy was struck, read simply, "If this does not reach Cedar Bend, plant nothing from Coin's hand. He does not mean the trees to live." Odessa sat with that notebook until the lantern guttered low, and understood, with a coldness that had nothing to do with the winter air, precisely who TC must be. She thought of the loan against her father's orchard, taken out. She now remembered. In the very season the canker rot had first appeared in Cedar Bend's trees, a loan her uncle had been strangely insistent her father accept, despite Nathaniel's own reluctance. She thought of how quickly, how conveniently, Thaddeus Coyne had produced papers calling that loan due the moment her father was in the ground, taking the orchard not for its fruit, which the blight had made worthless, but for the acreage itself, land that would fetch a fine price for grazing once every diseased tree upon it was cleared away. She understood then that her uncle had not simply profited from a blight that struck her father's orchard by unhappy accident. He had very likely known it was coming, had positioned himself to benefit from it, and had, if Okonkwo's fears were correct, played some hand in ensuring that the one shipment capable of saving the county's orchards from that same blight never arrived at all. It was not proof enough for any magistrate, not on its own. A dead wagon master's suspicions, however carefully recorded, could too easily be dismissed as the fearful fancy of a frightened man. What Odessa needed was confirmation that the canker rot itself had been deliberately spread rather than simply suffered, and some way to tie her uncle plainly to both the blight and the ambush that had kept its cure from ever reaching Cedar Bend. She began, quietly and without announcing her purpose to anyone, walking the ruined rows of her father's old orchard at dawn before Thaddeus's hired hands were about, examining the diseased trees the way her father had taught her to examine any living thing, patiently, without flinching from what she found. And she noticed, at the base of several of the oldest and once healthiest trees, a pattern of injury that did not look like any natural blight she had ever studied. Small, deliberate wounds in the bark, long since grown over, of the kind a person might make to introduce infection directly into a tree's healthy wood. She carried her observations, along with several samples of the diseased bark, to a horticultural inspector from the Territorial Agricultural Office stationed in Marrow Junction. A meticulous, soft-spoken woman named Prudence Ilkay, who had grown professionally suspicious over the past 2 seasons at how uniformly and how conveniently the canker rot seemed to have spread through Cedar Bend's more valuable orchard acreage, while sparing lesser, less desirable parcels nearby. Ilkay agreed to examine the samples formally, and confirmed within the week what Odessa had already begun to suspect in her heart. The pattern of infection was not consistent with a naturally spreading blight at all, but bore every hallmark of deliberate inoculation, likely introduced over more than one season by someone with access to the orchards, and at least a rudimentary knowledge of the disease's transmission. Word travels quickly in a town the size of Cedar Bend, and it did not take long for Thaddeus Coyne to hear that his niece was walking the old orchard rows at dawn and carrying diseased bark samples to territorial inspectors. He came to see her at the livery yard where she had taken to sleeping near the wagons and their precious hidden cargo, and he was, at first, almost gentle in the way a man is gentle with someone he still believes he can frighten quietly, rather than openly. He reminded her that grief could make a person see conspiracies in ordinary misfortune, that blight was blight, and bad luck was bad luck, and that it would be a shame for a girl with so little left in the world to squander what small reputation she had by making wild accusations against family. When Odessa did not waver, his tone hardened. He reminded her, without ever quite phrasing it as a threat, that the livery owner sheltering her still owed him money on an old cattle note, and that debts, like blights, had a way of arriving inconveniently for people who made themselves difficult. The town, for its part, was slow to turn against a man who had spent years cultivating an appearance of prosperous respectability, and there were merchants and ranchers enough in Cedar Bend who owed Thaddeus Coyne money or favors, and found it easier to whisper that grief had unsettled his niece's judgment than to imagine a man of his standing capable of poisoning his own brother's trees. For a hard stretch of weeks, Odessa felt the old, familiar weight of being dismissed before anyone had bothered to weigh the truth of her, and she thought, more than once, of simply taking the seed stock and Okonkwo's notebook and starting some quieter life far from a town that seemed determined to protect the man who had ruined her rather than believe the daughter he had ruined. It was Prudence Ilke, laying her own formal findings alongside Okonkwo's notebook one cold evening in the livery loft, who reminded Odessa that a graft either takes or it does not, regardless of how loudly anyone insists otherwise, and that the truth of a diseased tree does not depend on whether the man who poisoned it is believed innocent by his neighbors. So Odessa built her case the patient way her father had taught her to build anything worth keeping, season by season, wound by careful wound. And she brought it not to the Cedar Bend Town Council, where Thaddeus's friends and debtors might smother it in delay, but directly to the Territorial Agricultural Office's regional director, a formidable, plain-spoken woman named Augustina Reyes Bellwether, who had grown weary over several seasons of watching orchard failures across the county align a little too neatly with land speculators' interests. Reyes Bellwether reviewed Ilke's formal blight assessment, Okonkwo's notebook naming T.C., and his nephew at the freight office, and the freight office's own records. Subpoenaed within days once Reyes Bellwether's office formally opened an inquiry, showing that Thaddeus Coyne's nephew had indeed altered the Convoy's official manifest and leaked its true route to associates unconnected to any legitimate freight business. Associates who had since been identified through testimony gathered in the inquiry as the very raiders who struck the convoy and left Eli Okonkwo for dead in the desert beyond Yucca Breaks. What followed was neither swift nor dramatic in the manner of a dime novel, but it was, in the end, thorough. Thaddeus Coyne's freight and land dealings were frozen pending investigation. His nephew's testimony, given in exchange for leniency, confirmed both the manifest tampering and Coyne's foreknowledge of the ambush, and the orchard land he had claimed from Nathaniel Marsh's estate was returned to Odessa by county order, once the fraudulent nature of the original loan's interest calculations was examined by an actual attorney at last, appointed pro bono by Reyes Bellwether's office once the scandal became public. Thaddeus did not go to prison. His lawyers, paid for with money that had never rightly been his, saw to that, but he lost every grazing lease and freight contract he held in the county within a season, lost the respectable name he had spent years cultivating, and left Cedar Bend before the spring thaw, diminished in every way that had ever mattered to him. The seed stock that Eli Okonkwo had hidden beneath ordinary river sand, confirmed viable by Prudence Ilke's own careful testing, became the foundation of Cedar Bend's slow recovery from the blight that had nearly destroyed it, grafted, under Odessa's own patient hand, onto what healthy rootstock remained across a dozen struggling orchards, including her father's own, replanted at last in soil that had waited, through one hard winter, for someone willing to trust that a season's patience could still bring a dying tree back to bearing fruit. Odessa insisted, over the objections of a town council eager to name the recovered orchard land after whoever felt most deserving of the credit, that the first replanted grove be called the Marsh Okonkwo Orchard, so that anyone tasting its fruit in years to come would know that a wagon master's quiet trust and an orchard keeper's daughter, patient enough to dig through worthless sand, had brought it back from the edge of ruin. And so we return, as we always do, to where this story began. To a girl of 19 years standing in a freezing livery yard with a lantern in one hand and her father's old grafting knife in the other, staring down at what the whole county had assured her was only sand, heavy and useless and good for nothing at all. Odessa Marsh did not save Cedar Bend's orchards because fortune smiled on her. She saved them because her father had spent a childhood teaching her that nothing valuable ever looks finished in its early, unlikely state. And because she trusted, even at her most overlooked, that a graft given enough patient care would eventually take root regardless of who doubted it. What she carried up out of that wagon bed was never only seed and a dead man's notebook. It was proof that her father's faith in patient, honest tending had been worth keeping, and that an entire town's future could be waiting, unnoticed, beneath the very thing everyone had already agreed to call empty. Thank you for spending this time with Odessa and with us tonight, and we would love to know where in the world you're watching from. So please, tell us in the comments below. If her story stayed with you, we hope you'll share it with someone who needs reminding that what looks worthless at first glance is not always finished growing. And if you'd like more slow, cinematic stories like this one, we would be glad to have you follow along with us for what comes next. Before you go, we'd love to leave you with this. What is a time in your own life when you found real value in something everyone else had already written off? We read every answer you leave us, and we're grateful for each one. Until next time, stay close.